Time to entertain. So yeah, they released the Famicom in Japan in 1983, and then over here in the US, we got it in 1985, where you had games like Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt, and, you know, all the classics there. And then just a few years later, in 1989, they released the Game Boy. And every time that I think of 1989, the first thing that comes to my mind, which is hilarious, is actually Batman 1989. You know, for me, when it comes to years, I usually associate the year with what games were coming out that year. Like, if you say 2016, I say Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare and Modern Warfare Remastered. If you say 2015, I think like, you know, like Black Ops 3, for example. But when it comes to 1989, that's the one time where I think of a movie, and yeah, it's Batman 1989 that comes to mind every time that I think of that year. Nintendo goes super. We got the Super Nintendo in 1990. That brought us some of the best games and platformers of all time, like Super Mario World and Donkey Kong Country, and a bunch of other innovative titles like Super Mario RPG and Super Metroid and Star Fox and F-Zero. Like, the list goes on and on. The Super Nintendo, not only is it the first console that I ever played on, and again, I know I've said this so many times, I'm sorry for sounding like a broken record, but I always just reiterate why the Super Nintendo means so much to me, just because this is a relatively small channel, which means we have new viewers coming in all the time. So if you've heard this spiel, feel free to skip ahead like 10 to 20 seconds, but the first vivid memory from my life is playing Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo when I was 3 years old, you know, sitting late in the evening, sitting in front of the CRT, running through the temple level with Diddy Kong, jumping on the tires, avoiding the snakes and all that. Absolutely just so much nostalgia and love for the Super Nintendo, not only because of that, but also just because it is an amazing system in its own right. So I love the Super Nintendo, tons of nostalgia there. Then obviously in 1996 we got the Nintendo 64, which is just a fantastic console again in its own right, and was such a huge generational leap, going from a 16-bit system like the Super Nintendo to a system like this where you're running full 3D graphics games, and you even have games like Resident Evil 2 and Super Mario 64 and Zelda Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Mario Kart 64, the first Super Smash Bros. So many amazing games there. Then you had games that kind of bridged the gap between 3D but also their classic 2D stuff like Kirby 64. I love the Nintendo 64 so much. Even though playing Mario Party is enough to literally carve a hole in your hand, I still love the console. Then in 2001, we got the GameCube, which again is such an amazing system and one that I have so much nostalgia for. I love the GameCube, original Xbox, PS2 era. Not only were each of the consoles pumping out some amazing exclusives like Halo on the original Xbox, and then you had, I mean, when it comes to the place, like, where do I even begin there? You have games like Ratchet & Clank, Sly Cooper, Jak and Daxter, you know, the SOCOM games, Gran Turismo, like, the list literally goes on and on, Killzone. And then on the GameCube, I mean, come on, dude, Zelda, Twilight Princess, Wind Waker, Mario Sunshine, like, there were so many amazing first-party exclusives for the Nintendo GameCube, and it's a shame that it really, in the grand scheme of Nintendo consoles, I mean, you even see here, like, 22 million, like, that's nothing to even the 33 million of the N64 or the 49 million of the Super Nintendo, let alone the 62 million and the 81.5 million of the Game Boy, which, you know, even all these numbers in themselves is nothing compared to what we're gonna get to next. But man, the GameCube is one of those systems where I feel like over time, people have finally learned, like, oh yeah, this was actually an amazing system, and have finally started to give it the love it deserved. Because back in the day, anybody that had a GameCube or played on a GameCube knew how amazing the system was, especially with even, you know, even if it wasn't a long-term exclusive, even having temporary exclusives like Resident Evil 4 when they were still doing the Capcom 5 for the GameCube, for example. Like, the GameCube was a powerhouse, and there were so many amazing games released for the system, and it's awesome that in retrospect, more people are finally picking up GameCubes and again giving that console and that console's library the love that it deserves. But then just 5 years later in 2006, obviously we got the Nintendo Wii, and yeah, as you can see from the sales, 101 million. There's nothing that I can say about the Wii that hasn't been said before. It is such an amazing system. It lasted for 11 years from 2006 to 2017, with I believe the final game being like a Just Dance game or something like that released for the system. But I absolutely adore the Wii. Some people aren't a huge fan of the motion controls or the waggle or this, that, or the other, but I've always loved that stuff because I'm of the mindset that video games aren't just a GameCube controller. They aren't just an Xbox 360 controller. They can also be waggle. They can also be motion controls. They can also be big quirky gamepads. They can also be touch controls on an iPad or an iPod. They can also be butt ugly red screens with these giant bulky headsets that sit on a table that you stick your face into and play a nauseating match of tennis in the 1990s. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's one of those things where, like, gaming isn't just one thing. Gaming is it can be so much more than just your bog standard Xbox or PlayStation controller. And I'm not dissing gaming as a whole, because obviously I spend 99% of my time playing games on those consoles more or less, or playing with those types of control schemes. But again, gaming can be and should be allowed to be so much more than that. Let it expand to VR. Let it go crazy and do your mobile game gacha stuff. Let gaming be whatever it wants to be. Even if something isn't particularly for you, like I've always said, I'm not always one for like the super competitive PvP MOBA type of games nowadays. It's just one of those things where if I'm playing a game, usually I gravitate to something that's, you know, maybe has some PvP-ish elements, like Call of Duty. Like that's been my main multiplayer game that I actually stick with in terms of live service games nowadays, ever since Finest Hour on the PS2. Obviously Call of Duty only really became a live service back in 2019, but you know, to this day, I don't really touch live service games with a 10-foot flagpole, but Call of Duty is the one that I actually stick with just because I enjoy the game. But otherwise, when it comes to some of the more competitive or more, I don't know, I guess time-sucky live service games, I don't go near that stuff. It's nothing against the games, it's just more or less a time thing and really just like what I want out of a video game. And, you know, the stuff that's clearly just trying to be a black hole for your time isn't necessarily something I'm going to gravitate to. But for some people, that's exactly what they're looking for. And that's really the point that I'm trying to make here. Different strokes for different folks, as disgusting as that sounds. I've always hated that saying because it sounds so disgusting. Video games can be just whatever they want to be. And again, for me, I've always loved the waggle and the motion controls and all that stuff. I've always just thought it was like a fun personality trait of the Wii. But then moving on here, wait, where in the world is the, where's the Nintendo DS? That should have been right in, I mean, if they covered the Game Boy, I mean, I assume they're going to be covering that here soon, right? Next up, we got the Wii U, which is actually one of my favorite consoles of all time. I absolutely adore the Wii U, you know, the setup between the gamepad, the games that released for the system. Love the Wii U to death. And then we had the Wii Mini. Literally no data on the sales. For those who don't know, the Wii Mini was like a stripped down version of the Wii. It was like the Wii Lite. There was no internet features, no GameCube backwards compatibility. Forget it. The Nintendo Switch sold 103 million as of 2022. That's a lot higher now, but yeah, they go on to cover that. And obviously, you know, as much as I love the Wii U, there's an argument to be made that basically every main game that released for the Wii U is available on Switch. There is still a few exclusives over on the Wii U, and in some cases, there's games that even if they're available on the Switch, I prefer to play on the Wii U still, like Super Mario 3D World, for example. In the Switch version, they sped up the movement by like 25%, and I just prefer the speed of the original movement here in Wii U, so that's why I gravitate towards that one over the Switch version, for example. Again, there is an argument to be made that most of the games that released for the Wii U, most of the big titles have made their way to the Switch. I mean, the big Zelda title that was supposed to be exclusive to Wii U, that ended up just being a launch title for the Switch. You know what I mean? Here we go. Now they're talking about the handhelds. Nintendo has put so much fun and action at your fingertips over the years. Check out some of the ultimate handheld heroes. Yeah, the DS, releasing in 2004. And then in 2006, we got the DS Lite, 08/09, depending on the region. We got the DSi and the DSi XL and all that. Then 2011, 3DS, and the rest is history, baby.